I'm an editor at the University of Oklahoma Press, and I acquire books in the Southwest and Texas and Oklahoma and other regional titles. I'm really glad to be here. Working at the Witty with Maurice, something that goes back a ways with me, and on Texas art. And I'll just tell a quick story. But in 2004, Ron Tyler hired me as the director of publications for the Texas State Historical Association. And in my first week or so there, we had a meeting to discuss all the different things that were in progress and what needed to be done. And we talked about the quarterly, and we talked about the annual meeting. We talked about various other things. And he said, "Oh, and by the way, there's a bunch of boxes out in the hall that contain a book that is an art book that has to be done in a year for an exhibition that's opening at the Witty, and the Summerlee Foundation is supporting that." And I said, "Really? There's boxes out in the hall of a book that has to be done in a year, and it's a big art book." So after the meeting, I went out, and sure enough, there was a bunch of boxes out in the hall. And this was Cecilia Steinfeld's book on Seymour Thomas, and who I'd not heard of at the time. But I decided, well, having done this for a while, I knew this, a year is a short time to get a book like that out. So anyway, first thing I did was kind of go through the stuff, and then I called the Witty Museum to talk to Cecilia, who was then in her 80s, late 80s, and suffering from macular degeneration. And my first few phone calls were not successful in getting much done. So finally, someone hooked me up with Maurice McDermott, and Maurice wasn't the president at the time, but she came to Austin, and we sat down and met, and all of a sudden things started happening, and we started moving forward, and I was like, holy cow, I'm glad I met Maurice, because I don't think this would have ever gotten done without it. And so as I was complaining about my situation, Maurice was thinking, well, I've got a sister on campus, and she's complaining about her job too. Maybe these two should meet. And so anyway, she introduced me to Tara McDermott Carlisle, who is now my wife. And so that was my beginning of art at the Witty. So in the years when I was at Denton, the first time I met our speaker today, Michael Grauer, was we put on one of the first, I would say, significant exhibitions of Frank Ray at the UNT on the square downtown, and Michael was working at the Panhandle Plains at that time, and he was, glad enough to let us borrow some paintings from the collection, and he drove down and delivered them, and then came and picked them up when it was over, and that was the first time I met him, and that was really the first time I got to know anything about Frank Ray. And it's a fascinating story that we're going to hear about today. Michael was born in Kansas City, Kansas. He holds a Bachelor of Fine Arts in Painting and a Bachelor of Fine Arts in Art History from the University of Kansas, Master of Arts in Art History from Southern Methodist University, and a Master in Arts in History from West Texas A&M University. He worked at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, the Meadows Museum at SMU, and the Dallas Museum of Art before becoming curator of art at the Western Heritage at the Panhandle Plains, curator of art and Western Heritage at the Panhandle Plains Historical Museum in Canyon, Texas. He was also adjunct lecturer in Western American Studies at West Texas A&M University. He was University of Kansas Crest Foundation Department of Art Distinguished Alumnus for 2012. He joined the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum in Oklahoma City in September 2018, where he curated Cowboys in Khaki, Westerners in the Great War, to honor the Centennial of World War I, which is a fantastic exhibition that I've seen. Michael's recently come to Oklahoma, and we were in the airport not long ago commiserating. He was trying to adapt to the Oklahoma freeway system, and I was telling him, give it a few more months, and you won't understand it, but you won't want to kill yourself every time you try to get on the freeway in Oklahoma. So I think that helped him a little bit. But anyway, he has curated numerous exhibitions on historic Texas, New Mexico, and Southwestern art and history at the Panhandle Plains Historical Museum and as a guest curator for other institutions. He is the author of more than 50 publications, including Rounded Up in Glory. His book on H.D. Bugbee is being published by Texas A&M University Press in 2019. And I'll just say, a plug for you guys to support your local university press and make sure you buy Michael's book and make sure you buy Ron Tyler's book, Western Art, Western History, which was published recently by the University of Oklahoma Press. We need the support and all that we can get. So anyway, please join me in welcoming Michael Grauer.
Well, somebody left their notes up here, and I don't use notes, so I'm going to set these over here. It's an honor to be at the Whitty. Anytime I get to come to the Whitty, anytime I get to come to San Antonio, it's always an honor because it is, in many ways, the heart of Texas art, and I agree with Maurice and everything she said in the last few days. San Antonio, of course, was the center for art making in Texas until about 1930. When it shifts to Dallas, and Dallas holds serve for the next 20 years until things shift to Houston. But really, as one of the oldest cities in the state, it's appropriate that this exhibition is here. And it didn't occur to me till Kent was just reading that introduction, and when people introduce me, I always look over my shoulder wondering who they're talking about, because I've been doing this for a little while, and when he mentioned that I worked at Smithsonian American Art Museum, there are several pieces in the exhibition that I actually hung on the wall at Smithsonian about 35 years ago. And likewise, the Meadows Museum, where the mountains meet the plains, comes from SMU, and I inventoried the University Art Collection when I was a graduate student there. And then Panhandle Plains, I'm proud to see Panhandle Plains represented in there as robustly as it is, especially the Frank Rays. Because I rode herd literally on those paintings. There were about 600 of them in the collection up there, and they were my chapel. Whenever things got bad, I would go into the vault where you couldn't see me, and I'd just look at one after the other, and they're on shelves like little books. And they are all our little stories about Mr. Ray. And I'm remiss in not, I should have reminded the folks here at the Whitty that the title I gave them back several months ago is not what I'm going to talk about today. I'm only slightly kidding. But Ron Tyler gave me the courage. He gave his lecture, a different version of his lecture that he gave at lunch yesterday at Caseta last month. And he reminded me of things that are in my essay that are in the upcoming book, where I talk a lot about Texas art as Western art, in particular with Mr. Ray. And what I'm going to lecture on today is something I do whenever I teach Art of the American West, and that's there are 3 R's of Western art, and Frank Ray is the third one: Remington, Russell, and Ray. And that's where we're going to go today. And I'm going to take you through that journey and what that means to compare those 3 giants of American art. And that's key because that's something I've also heard in the last couple of days is, and those of you who know me and have heard me talk, you know that the more we ghettoize Texas art, the more it hurts Texas art. And what Francine has done and others have done in talking about Texas art as American art is absolutely vital. And to put Frank Ray in another conversation where he's been left out and was at one time very much part of that conversation is what we're going to talk about today. So without further ado, and I know we have a timer, but I understand that there was supposed to be another lecturer, so I get to use that lecturer's time too. So when this fine young lady stands up and holds up the paddle, I'm going to ignore her, and I hope you all will too. So the third R of Western art, and I know with some of you that gives you chills to think about a Texas art, an institution, the father of Texas painting, depending on which side of the San Antonio River you're standing, because many say it was Robert Onderdonk, but remember, Mr. Ray was in Texas 3 years before Onderdonk got here. Yes, I'm very competitive about my boy, that's true. Okay, so as you see by the slide here on the screen, Mr. Ray was well aware of his relationship with Charlie Russell and Frederic Remington, and he talked very specifically about Remington in the 90s, painted the Indian in his pony. He knew little about cows and was principally interested in the cowboy as a wild man. And he also understood that what Russell was doing was mostly limited to the Northwest. Mr. Russell did come through El Paso on one trip to the Southwest, and we heard yesterday that Remington was here too. So Mr. Ray was very, very well aware of his place. And this quotation here from his biographical in 1936, I was the only artist, it seems, who thought of trail drives in Texas Longhorns as being a subject to paint. And this is absolutely critical. I do believe Mr. Ray knew of his historic place in American art and world art, and understood that there was a particular historic thing happening with the trail drives, because that window of opportunity for people to come in and capitalize on the cattle industry was relatively narrow. It really was, because, and this launches into my other area of research, which is trail driving and ranching history, is that those cattlemen knew that the window was very small. And so after the Civil War, up until about 1890, that's a 25-year window, give or take, they knew that the farmers were right behind them. And despite what it says in Oklahoma about the farmers and the cowboys should be friends, the cattlemen knew that their window of opportunity to capitalize on the beef bonanza was very, very limited. And Mr. Ray understood his historic place. So he's a history painter, and I want you to remember that. He's a history painter for the state of Texas and what the Southwest eventually would become. Charlie Russell, of course, was well known, especially through his images like this one, when he paints an image of the Great Die-Up and the Great Blizzard in winter of 1886-87, and becomes quite well known. But he's already in Montana by the early 1880s, and that's important to understand that all three of these men were in the American West by the 1880s. Frederic Remington, of course, went to Kansas to try to be a cowboy and eventually became a sheep herder, and then eventually owned a saloon, and then started making accurate renderings of the trail drive industry from his own experience, which was relatively limited, quite frankly. And remember that Remington's early work was redrawn by people before it was published in the popular magazines such as Scribner's and Harper's and so on. And so, you know, and it's a long, long story about his time in Kansas City, but it is important to remember to put him in context. But Mr. Ray was already in Texas by 1876. And when he paints O Roundup that you see on the screen now, it is one of those images that really transcends where it's painted in terms of this state, because what he depicts in O Roundup, a depiction of a scene west of Henrietta, Texas, which was a primary cattle shipping point at this time, was the Great Plains. And we don't really understand that because most people think of the Great Plains as flyover country. Well, I lived on the Great Plains for 31 years, and I'm a llanero. I am. And there are no trees. There aren't any trees. And Mr. Ray captured that, and I know of no other piece in American art that ever captured this as well as he did with O Roundup. And it's an absolute masterpiece. This is his greatest painting, in my opinion. But he was also photographing by the late 1880s, and he was photographing things that no one else was photographing. And J. Frank Dobie even wrote that Mr. Ray probably photographed and painted the only images we have of a true Texas Longhorn, because the artists that were sent out west primarily painted from what they thought, or from what they thought they knew instead of what they saw. And it's critical to understand how Mr. Ray got to Texas, and he came down basically the former cattle trail known as the Shawnee Trail, which took cattle from Texas up through northeast Texas, up across what was then Indian Territory, into Missouri, and on up into Illinois. And Mr. Ray grew up in southern Illinois, which was cattle receiving country, until the Texas fever started to warrant quarantines by the 1850s in Illinois and the 1860s in Missouri, and then kept moving west. And that's important to understand the historical context in which he was painting. But his family immigrated to Texas down what was called the Texas Road, which was the reverse direction of the Shawnee Trail. So he was actually probably running into some herds of cattle that were still going up the Shawnee Trail. So he was experiencing them certainly by the 1870s in person, and he's 16 years old by this time, and that's important. But the cattle industry, as I mentioned before, is a phenomenon after the Civil War, and I don't want to spend too much time on it, but it's important to understand Joseph McCoy's gamble to create a new industry in the center of the United States, taking advantage of that product, which was Texas cattle, and a workforce, which was Texas cowboys, riding on another product, which was Texas horses, and they were bringing these animals through Joseph McCoy's Great Gamble into towns in Kansas and getting on the rail lines, okay? So McCoy's part of our story too. And cattle coming out of Texas, of course, had to cross the numerous rivers, and this is one of those parts where Lonesome Dove gets it right, because crossing the rivers was one of the things the drovers dreaded more than anything, because none of them could swim. And so the trails that came out, and we were talking at supper last night about the Goodnight Loving Trail, that's a lecture for another day, but you can see the great tree that has its trunk down here into San Antonio in South Texas. This is really where it starts, and it grows north up the Shawnee, eventually the Chisholm, the Western, and then, of course, the Goodnight Loving Trail, which I think was primarily to avoid the Comanches, and we heard about Comanches yesterday. But I also believe that the military played a huge role in this, and this is actually a more focused map to show you where the trails were in Texas. And just for point of reference, the Chisholm Trail was not the Chisholm Trail in Texas, as we learned from Wayne Ludwig's new book. It was simply called the Texas Trail. The Western had no grade attached to it, and we need to remember that at all times. And the military, as I started to say, the military played a role in this, and I think the military, the U.S. Army, was complicit in the cattle trade because there were officers who were very much part of that. And you'll notice where the military forts were primarily to protect the trade. But again, I mentioned before, this is Comancheria, and nobody asked the Comanches if this was okay. And of course, the cattle trails go right through Comancheria, primarily from about 1750 to 1850, when they were probably at their peak, roughly about 35,000 people. And then by the end of the Red River War, there were about 3,500 of them. And that's important to remember the context. So Comancheria kept reducing in size from all the way down into northern Mexico, and the cattle trails initially skirted them. But as I said before, the initial artists who were sent out to record these phenomenon thought that Texas Longhorns looked like Guernseys or Jerseys, and Mr. Reaugh, of course, knew better than that. And so these initial illustrations in Harper's and Scribner's and so on really sort of got the story about half right, and I think this was part of the charge that Mr. Reaugh felt was to get the story right. But it also gave rise to how popular culture latched onto the cowboy and also sucked in Missouri border war guerrillas like Jesse James, and somehow today Jesse James is a cowboy, which is another phenomenon for another day. But the Wild West shows, of course, attached onto the attraction of the cowman as a wild man, and we heard a little bit about that in some of the lectures recently. My feeling is this was largely a promotion of city dwellers who feared the cowboy and the drover when he came to town, largely because of their women. Daughters and wives were highly attracted to these men in big hats, who were immensely polite and really would rather drink a can of peaches than a glass of whiskey in my research. And eventually gives rise to Western fiction, which really culminates with the publication of the Virginian in 1902. And next thing you know, everybody who can pick up a pen is writing true and accurate Western stories. And included other artists, frontline artists like N.C. Wyeth, who went out west and worked as a cowboy for 9 days, and then went back to Pennsylvania and dressed up Andrew and Henriette and everybody else in cowboy clothes, and so he could make accurate Western illustrations. However, most of these stories, or many of these stories, were serialized in ladies' magazines. Ladies, these were the telenovelas of the day, and so when you were at home in the latter part of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century, you couldn't wait to read about that sweaty cowboy that you left last month. And eventually this gives rise, of course, to the pulp westerns of the 1930s, where action and rescue were very much part of the equation. And even Norman Rockwell got involved, and I love this painting because it shows Gary Cooper getting lipstick applied to make sure he could play a cowboy. It made its way into popular culture. Of course, TV westerns had their own Emmy category. Did you all know that? And by the 1950s, and it gives rise to all kinds of popular culture things, even into A. Brandt Furniture in Fort Worth, Texas. So, back to our story. This is the climate in which Mr. Reaugh painted the historical paintings that he painted, all about the cattle driving industry. And this is a photograph of Mr. Reaugh, roughly about 1890. He was a handsome devil, as you can see. Very much from Irish descent. The Castlereagh part of his name, I think, is largely a fabrication, but they were Irish by descent, came through Kentucky into Illinois, and eventually into Texas by 1876, settling in Kaufman County. They settled near a little whistle stop place. Notice I used whistle stop there, Rauschenberg. You're paying attention, that's good. There'll be a quiz. A whistle stop called Lawrence, which doesn't exist anymore, and eventually they moved right on into Terrell, where George Washington Ray, his father, worked as a carpenter primarily. But Mr. Ray began sketching what he called Texas cattle, probably on the West Shawnee Trail. And these were largely animals that were brought north to, as he said, fatten on the luxurious grasses of North Texas, and then probably pushed up the Chisholm, or what would become known as the Chisholm later in popular culture. In this painting here, The Approaching Herd, is in the exhibition. It was painted in 1902, and it's one of at least 6 versions of this particular scene, because longhorns coming over a hill was something that really struck his heart. And as Ron told us yesterday, he saw the Texas longhorn as a beautiful thing, and he saw it as a wild creature, very much a part of nature. But it's also important to remember that by the time he's painting most of these animals in the 1880s, they're mostly mixed bloods by this time. They're usually crossed with Durhams or Shorthorns, and a little bit later Herefords. Please notice the J.C. Coles painting hanging in the exhibition that shows Hereford cattle on the J.A. Ranch by 1887, and they're probably mixed. But his first trip to what he called Western Texas was out near in Palo County in about 1883, but he's already in the West. As soon as he crosses the Mississippi River, he's a Western artist, because we need to remember the Trans-Mississippi West, of course, is where it begins. And so he's in Western Texas, and he makes small pastel sketches en grisaille, as you can see here. This is one of my favorite things in the Panhandle Plains collection, because it's about the size of a playing card. And of course, Mr. Ray's work transcends size and scale. Mr. Ray eventually studied in St. Louis by the middle of the 1880s, and then secured enough money through working as a school teacher to earn a trip to study in Paris. He made the sketch for Watering the Herd here on the top in May of 1887 out near Henrietta, in that part of the country, and then he went over to study at the Académie Julian, which we heard about yesterday in William Rudolph's excellent lecture about Texas Impressionism. He finished the painting that's in the exhibition, the one on the bottom, after he got back. So it appears that there were no lessons that he learned while he was in France. But Mr. Ray was a highly intelligent artist, and we heard this from William yesterday, because he was truly an intellectual. Most of his paintings had some sort of log sheet. And when I say paintings, I mean the large scale pieces, generally had some sort of log sheet where he'd actually keep check marks when he referred to an old master painting. That's how I deduced what he was doing. So if he's looking at a J.M.W. Turner, he would make a hash mark, because I was thinking of Turner today when I worked on this painting. And it goes right on down the list, and there'll be 30 to 50 paintings that he's referred to on these hash marks. And Watering the Herd, of course, is one of his first great masterpieces. There were others that had happened before that, but this is one really requires study. This is a man-made stock tank. As you can see, it's not a natural pool, but of course, and you can see from this that these are all crossbreeds here, probably Shorthorns and Durhams crossed with Texas Longhorns. In 1893, he decided to go farther west, because up to this time, that was about as far as he would go, usually following one of the paths of one of the West Texas rivers. But he decided it was time to go up onto the Panhandle Plains, onto the Llano Estacado, and he took along letters of introduction to important people, not the least of whom was Charles Goodnight. And Mr. Goodnight, of course, accepted him there, and Mr. Ray eventually made sketches of lower Palo Duro Canyon until he went up. And remember, Palo Duro Canyon, of course, is the second largest canyon in the U.S. It's 120 miles long and 50 miles wide at its widest point. How many of you have ever been to Palo Duro Canyon? I'm impressed. Good job. You all get a star today and a cookie. So he's painting in lower Palo Duro Canyon and worked his way northwest. And he also photographed on Goodnight's ranch. By this time, Colonel Goodnight had something of a wildlife park with bison, as you can see on the right, and these are elk. These are photographs by Mr. Ray that he took in 1893 and 94 when he's in the Texas Panhandle. And Panhandle Plains, in addition to the 600 works in color that he did while he was there, and I include the grisailles as well, but there are about 400 glass plate negatives and or photographs that frankly need a publication. Mr. Reaugh, as frontier photographer, really has never gotten the love that he should. He never exhibited them. These were a sketching tool, and that's important to remember. He's also probably the first artist to photograph and paint what's known as the lighthouse on the right there in Palo Canyon, and this is Capitol Peak. Of course, this, as I said before, this is on that 93, 94 trip. And there's probably the very first painting of the lighthouse that's used as a tourist emblem by the city of Amarillo frequently. And the painting on the left is probably Tool Canyon, which has its own place in Texas history, as most of you know. But I'm fascinated by his photographs as much as anything. This is a sketch photograph for the O Roundup done in 1894. I like it because the emulsion went sideways, and I think it's a great work of art as it is. It's really one of those happy accidents. It's a spectacular thing. But he also did photograph cowboys at work, not cowboys that came from his imagination, but ones that he actually saw and witnessed. This is a cowboy herding a herd of horses, a little remuda. And you can see Mr. Reagh's sketch wagon. I wish the lights could come down a little bit, but this is a sketch wagon there in the background. Mr. Reaugh did, in fact, attempt to accompany a couple of the cattle drives, but putting all of the sketching equipment on the back of a saddled horse is not something that a horse really appreciated. And I talk about this in my book. If those of you don't have a copy, they sell them right there at that little store outside the door. And A&M Press gives me about 14 cents per book, so it's not about that. It's about spreading the knowledge. And I felt compelled when I wrote the book to make sure that we got the record straight, because there are really some very nice picture books about Mr. Reaugh that have been done, but there are a lot of errors about his biography. And Peter Mears oversaw a tremendous exhibition at the University of Texas a couple of years ago, and the catalog that accompanied that with really fine essays was really something you should have in your Frank Reaugh library, quite frankly. And that came up yesterday. What about the Reaughs at the University of Texas? I'm not going to talk about that right now. We'll do that during the Q&A. But as I said before, he would use photographs as a sketching tool. This is a small sketch at Panhandle Plains of a painting called Mr. Jack that I believe Kevin Vogel had at one time about 25 years ago. I'm cursed with a photographic memory, and I rarely forget when I see something. He also would make pastel sketches of paintings that would turn into what I would call a medium-sized oil, and the one on the bottom is about this size. Many prominent families in North Texas had examples of his work. Rainy Day shows, of course, the things that we're used to seeing by Charlie Russell and Frederic Remington, but Mr. Reaugh was doing them too. February in Texas was one of two paintings he showed at the World's Fair in Chicago in 1893. This painting in its large version, this is the sketch, is lost. We don't know where it is. But of course, he did show at the World's Columbian Exposition in 1893, which was part of his exhibition record, which is key for us to remember his place in American art. And this is the other one that he showed in Chicago. It just surfaced. It's this big. No, I can't tell you who owns it. I'm sworn to secrecy, and I'd have to kill you. But he also continued to show with the Society of Western Artists. I believe this is Society of Western Artists. Oh, no, Pennsylvania Academy. He was invited to exhibit at the annual at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, and he showed paintings like you see here by the early 1890s. And he also, here's the piece that he showed there, In the Rain, which he would show again a little bit later. But the fact that he's being invited by the mid-1890s to show in these prominent exhibitions is key. Here's the Pennsylvania Academy, and a similar version of this is at the Gilcrease Museum in Oklahoma. As you can see, that same year, Reaugh, let's see, sent his pastel. I'm quoting myself there, obviously. But in any case, this is the work that he sent. Sheepherder's Camp, of course, surfaced just a few years ago and was one of the primary mid-1890s works that he would lend for exhibition in different parts of the state. These are a couple of others that are in the Gilcrease collection that you never see, and they're very, very large. They're large pieces that Mr. Gilcrease acquired. And of course, he had a one-man show at Laredo Taft's studio in Chicago in the mid-1890s, and by this time, of course, had really strong ties to Chicago, St. Louis, and many Midwestern cities. And his work was critically acclaimed, as you can see in this quotation from the Sunday Chicago Inter-Ocean newspaper. And the O Roundup was one of the ones that caught the attention of the critic, because he felt that no one really captured it like Mr. Reaugh, and that's true. He became friends with the writer Hamlin Garland, and Garland, of course, was very popular in the mid-1890s. in Chicago and was a primary mover and shaker for the World's Columbian Exposition to include paintings by American Impressionists, and they became longtime correspondents to the point where they traded works of art. Something like this is something that caught the eye of Hamlin Garland, and at one point he owned a painting of cowboys herding cattle by Mr. Reaugh. The National Academy of Design, of course, invited him to come exhibit there in the mid-90s as well. And so really between about 1890 and about 1910 was his heyday as a front-running American artist. And it's through these exhibitions that also included the Society of Western Artists. Now, before you get too alarmed, the Society of Western Artists really went no further west than Indiana. So most of these artists were from Ohio, Indiana, Michigan. The Old Northwest is what it was called, but it was the Midwest by this time. And Mr. Reaugh was an associate member, and he could only join through the chapter that was in St. Louis. The other members of this group who were actually true Western artists, along with Mr. Reaugh, were Bert Phillips and Joseph Henry Sharp from the Taos Colony. So it was sort of a misnomer to call them Western artists. Okay, Breezy Morning is a painting that appeared not too long ago, and as you can see, this is sort of its exhibition history to show you how well toured his work was. And we heard a little bit about the Texas Coast Fair yesterday in William Rudolph's lecture. There you can see the Texas Coast Fair in Galveston. Actually, it's in Dickinson, isn't it, Randy? Yeah, Dickinson. In 1896. But you can see it's well traveled until he sold it for $100 in Kansas City. And it's about this big, and it's in oil. And here's Mr. Reaugh in his studio at the height of his prowess and his recognition nationally. As you can see, multiple paintings in the works, and you can see the small field sketch tacked to the easel right above the larger canvas below it. That easel is in the Panhandle Plains Historical Museum collection, covered with hundreds of tack holes, as you can imagine. But in the mid-90s, there were other artists who were also working in this Western vein, one of whom was Frederic Remington, who I mentioned before, had been out to Kansas by the early 1880s, making a watercolor of his little sheep ranch. But he was fascinated by Texas. He may not have liked Texas, but he was fascinated by Texas, and especially Texas cowboys, who appear in many of his paintings, not the least of which is Dash for the Timber, which is ostensibly based on an episode in Arizona, but does include cowboys of all stripes, including Tejanos, probably some Vaqueros, certainly, and we're not sure where they came from, but it's one of the earliest depictions, 1889, in the Amon Carter collection. The Fall of the Cowboy was part of a series of illustrations that ultimately were part of a group to associate with Owen Wister's writings on the life and apogee, and then the Fall of the Cowboy. And this is one of my favorite Remingtons in the Carter collection. But as I said before, he was fascinated by Texas types and types of cowboys all over the place, and they nearly always carry a gun. His first lesson in the Amon Carter Museum talks about Remington's own experiences, which are largely based using a Kodak camera, and also sketching both in pencil, watercolor, and in pen and ink. A couple of paintings from the museum where I work now, National Cowboy Museum. And he very much deals in mythology, in my opinion, Remington does, except when you're looking at things like this In from the Night Herd, which is a spectacular nocturne by Remington, but Remington himself really probably never experienced this the way Frank Ray did. And of course, Stampede in the Gilcrease Museum is one of the great American paintings of all time, and we'll get back to that theme of Stampede here in a minute. Mr. Remington, of course, felt he would endure in bronze, and so his cowboy bronzes are very much part of his playbook. He also dabbled in pastel in a group called A Bunch of Buckskins, and Cheyenne Buck here is part of that group. There's another example in the Sid Richardson collection in Fort Worth, as you see here. The originals of these are largely extant, although we really can't track them all down. And his large, big cowboy that's in a park in Philadelphia is very much part of what we know about Remington. Likewise, Charlie Russell, a Midwesterner born in St. Louis, eventually makes his way up north to work as a cowpuncher, works on a sheep ranch. Also, I'm not degrading that, by the way. I'm just mentioning it's part of the historical record, the sheep thing. And wanted to be an artist in the early 1880s, as you can see by his early work. And we've seen this painting before, of course, which catches the attention of the nation. But his early works that are in the Carter are absolutely seminal to understanding life in a cow camp, especially in the mornings when you're trying to get on the back of a cold green broke horse. They, of course, are not your friend, despite what Roy and Trigger wanted you to believe. The horses don't like you. They're not your friend. But Mr. Reaugh, of course, is photographing at virtually the same time and also painting this sort of thing down in Texas, a better image of the Roundup brush arbor that you can see that the Cowboys are using in this particular Roundup. And compare it, for example, to how his depiction of a Roundup differs and relates directly to what Charlie Russell was doing too. This is a watercolor that speaks directly to some of Mr. Reaugh's work, wolves attacking in a blizzard from 1890 or so. But Russell also, as Mr. Reaugh pointed out, was very interested in cowboys of the Northwest almost exclusively. So the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago contained only one of the 3 R's in its main hallways at the brand new, what's now the Art Institute of Chicago building. I bet you can guess the only one who was exhibited in the main hall. Correct, Frank Reaugh. Frederic Remington. Frederic Remington, of course, was a prize-winning artist by this time, but chose not to show his work except for a handful of Grisaille's illustrations in another building. But he also did illustrations of things that he saw at the World's Fair, and that included a North African rider, which plays into another narrative for another day, as you can see. Of course, part of Cowboy Ground Zero is North Africa. I had to throw that in there for you. Charlie Russell showed in the Montana Pavilion, not in the Fine Arts Building, these 2 paintings that are spectacular, but they were not included amongst the fine art pieces. Only Frank Reaugh's work was included in that exhibition, as you can see. And I think that's critical to understanding his place as it was at that time. 10 years later, in 1904, the Louisiana Purchase Exposition in his sort of second hometown of St. Louis occurs with double life-size or 3 times life-size sculptures out on the Esplanade in St. Louis. This is Solon Borglum, the Louisiana Purchase piece Resting Cowboy. Borglum had, in fact, worked as a cowboy himself. But coming through the Reaugh, the pieces that, as it's known today, was center place here. But Remington didn't exhibit in the Fine Arts Hall. I mean, why would he need to when you have something like this outside? Russell again did not exhibit in the Fine Arts Halls in the new St. Louis Museum of Fine Arts. Russell exhibited in the Montana Pavilion again, but Mr. Reaugh did. Yes, he did. And so by this time, of course, he's reached his peak, and he's showing his work all around the country. He's recognized by critics as well as writers. He's showing with the New York Watercolor Club. He's showing in New York City. He's showing in Pittsburgh. He's showing in all the appropriate places. And then he starts inventing. And he always lamented the fact that he basically lost his rabbit's foot when he started dabbling with inventions. And I write about this in the book, and he regretted that. And so, in my opinion, in an attempt to sort of regain that in 1914 and 15, he went up to Wyoming and Montana and attempted to capture the attention of the former Texan and soon to be, or I think he was a senator by this time, John B. Kendrick, who came from a long line of Texas cowmen who went up to be a politician in Montana, and he painted Powder River, which he considered his finest landscape in oil. As you can see, the little herd of cattle down here and the little cowboy in the foreground. And I would agree with him because it's really quite a spectacular painting. But he attempted to get Governor Kendrick interested in this for his personal collection, but failed. And eventually it was exhibited in Dallas and then became part of his core collection that eventually went to the University of Texas. In the late 1920s, of course, something he'd been working on his entire life. I think in an attempt to sort of recapture some of that, not so much fame, but the attention and especially his place in history, because he knew that he was a history painter and he recorded something nobody else did accurately. And so he cooked up a series of prose sketches in conjunction with other writers and musicians, and I don't have time to go into 24 Hours with the Herd. In fact, Ron Tyler does an excellent performance of 24 Hours with the Herd, which I've only seen once. I saw it in Terrell one time with Peter Mears But I understand the Austin Symphony did great things with it a few years back, something I'd love to bring to the Cowboy Museum to show them that all cowboying starts in Texas, just as a reminder. But of course, Driving the Herd is a painting we saw an example of yesterday. Watering the Herd here, and I'm not going to go through this specifically because the words are there, but they were all about telling a story only Mr. Ray witnessed. And these paintings, of course, are in the vault at the University of Texas. Bedding the Herd here. The Stampede, of course, his version of the Stampede did talk about one of the other great things cowboys feared besides drowning, which, of course, when you're dealing with an animal that's wild and dumb as a box of rocks, they really are unpredictable, and you never know what they're going to do. And you're also on as Charlie Sirengo said, on the hurricane deck of another wild kind of animal, and an animal that doesn't like you. And of course, Milling Cattle, of course, is about regret and remembrance, waving to those cowboys on the top who are actually ghost figures on the cliff as they go away after they've been trampled in the stampede. And then the final, The Herd Moves On, did in two versions, one in pastel and one called Distant Herd Going in 1927. This painting is at Panhandle Plains, and it's one of the more fascinating paintings to me because it shows Mr. Ray clearly as a modernist. This is color field painting, folks. This is Rothko before there's Rothko. Now, Mr. Ray did not like modernists, but he was a modernist nevertheless. In 1924, in recognition of where he stood, Findlay Gallery, which was one of the very first art gallery to handle Frederic Remington's work in Kansas City, began handling Remington in 1893, invited Mr. Ray to send works to a show of only the finest painters of the West. Mr. Ray still being recognized for that. And of course, Findlay Art Gallery, as I mentioned before, was one of the first to show Frederic Remington's work. And it later showed Charlie Russell's work, but not until the 1960s. But it also showed the work of H.D. Bugbee by the early 1920s, when Mr. Bugbee took a trainload of J.A. cattle up to sell while he was working as a hand there, sold the cattle and went right up to Findlay's and secured them as his representatives. So Mr. Ray saw himself as a history painter, and this is key, a landscape and cattle painter. One of the things that's frustrated me during my career, especially in the early days, was people would send me images, and this is pre-internet now, people would send me something called a photograph, printed on paper, and say, well, it don't seem to have no cows in it. Yeah, and? I mean, he was a landscape painter first and foremost, but he was also a history painter, and the cattle industry was very much part of that, and this is his calling card, as you can see from his Oak Cliff studio. So you would think that the state of Texas would, of course, recognize this when the Texas Centennial was coming around, and eventually Dallas secures the Texas Central Centennial Exposition and built a brand new fine arts museum with air conditioning to host one of the finest exhibitions of Texas art that's ever been seen, second only to the one that's in galleries next door, of course. Mr. Ray was not invited to the party. Now, part of this was his own, he's to blame for this. He thought they should have invited him. He didn't think his work needed to be juried by anybody, least of all one of his students named Alexander Hogue. So he didn't submit anything for jury, and he was not invited, okay? He was invited to, in fact, buy a vendor's license along with the hot dog salesman and the candy corn salesman, and he was allowed some space next to the livestock pavilion. And under a tent, let me back up here. Under a tent, he showed on easels in a sort of a scumbled together affair 24 hours with the herd and his work. He was offered a space in the Ranger building, but he was largely insulted by that, and justifiably so. So his hometown of Dallas since 1890, so for 46 years Dallas had been his home, they turned their back on him. Fort Worth did not. Fort Worth invited him to the competitive Texas Centennial Exposition, the Fort Worth Frontier Centennial Exposition in Fort Worth, where they were all about the American West. Imagine that. Long before they were the birthplace of the West, Fort Worth bought into this, and Amon Carter was very much part of this. And you can see, and I know Francine talked about this in her lectures, and others have as well, that it was all about the American West. And interestingly, as you can see, the artists who were invited were Mr. Ray's peers. You can see them all across there, including a couple of the Taos artists, George Catlin, who was one of the earliest artists to work in Texas, Frederic Remington and Charlie Russell, of course. and W. Herbert Dunton, and I'm remiss to not tell you that as long as I've been working on Frank Reaugh, I've also been working on Buck Dunton. So those are my boys, and it's gratifying to me in many ways to see Old Texas being part of this exhibition as well. So Mr. Reaugh exhibited Margaret's Peak as part of his work that was sent to Fort Worth. He was asked to send 24 hours there, but he felt in some ways beholden to Dallas to at least give it a try and show it next to the hogs and the steers and the prize chickens at the Dallas Centennial Exposition. So he showed Margaret's Peak there as part of that bigger exhibition. So Frederic Remington's work, especially his late work, is considered his best by art historians because he's beginning to work in an acceptable vein as an American Impressionist. He started to hobnob to a certain extent with many of the artists that William Rudolph talked about yesterday, and especially those from Old Lyme, Connecticut. And so his work changed dramatically. It ended up burning about 75 canvases by the early part of the 1900s, about 1906 or so, burned canvases that he felt did not support his current status as a fine artist. And Buffalo Runners, Bighorn Basement on the right, which is in the Sid Richardson collection, I just offer you to compare visually to the Stampede painting that I teased you with early on. Buffalo Runners is about this big. Stampede is this big. And it helps us with a lesson on the differences between size and scale. Mr. Reagh's scale is on par with all the other artists who were working at the time. And also compare Mr. Reagh's Approaching Herd to Wolves Attacking in Winter by Charlie Russell there on the right. You can clearly see that they were working in similar veins. And so when he passed in 1936, or 1945, after the humiliation of the Texas Centennial Exposition, he started talking in his letters in the 1940s that he really felt like he needed to live somewhere else. And he was thinking on moving to Fort Worth, to Austin, and to San Antonio, because he knew at least there he was respected for the work that he put in over those many years, those many decades in Dallas. And so I'll just leave you with this. I want you to consider, I hope, if you just simply look at the historical record, the exhibition record, and especially the works that he gave to us on paper and on canvas, and you can see two primary examples in the galleries next door, give a thought to the fact that there were, in fact, 3 R's of Western art: Remington, Russell, and Frank Reaugh. Thanks. I guess I can take questions. Oh, come on. Mr. Keeber.
So now that you're not at Canyon, Texas, what would you say about the huge concentration of his art at one institution?
Okay, that's a long answer. Okay. Mr. Reaugh kept a core collection of his larger paintings, not all of them, but a core collection that he felt, as a history painter for the state of Texas, he was obligated to give back to the people of Texas, and especially what he called the children of Texas, because he felt like his life's work was something that depicted, or he knew his life's work was something that nobody else had depicted. And so he intended to donate it initially to the city of Dallas, because there was to be a gallery for his work initially in Highland Park. That fell through. And when it looked like there was not going to be the care and feeding of that collection in Dallas, eventually he builds El Seville, but by this time the work, there's really no mechanism to keep the works in Dallas, so he eventually gives them to the University of Texas in 1938, that core collection, which really didn't contain very many field sketches. It was all finished paintings. And he gave it to the children of Texas because he thought the university at that time, and it cared about Texas at that time. And he felt like this was the best way to share it. He felt the students ought to be able to see, not the Frank Reaugh Art Museum, that's not what he intended. He titled his collections Paintings of the Southwest. And he felt he was very service-oriented in that respect, public service-oriented. And so he wanted to give back. And he sent it to the University of Texas. And I talk about this a lot, and I'm a bit of a zealot about that. Before the ink was dry, the University of Texas was already trying to abrogate that agreement they made with him. No, we're not going to build you a new building. We'll give you a portion of the old library building. And by this time, he's old. He's already also losing his eyesight, and that's a lot, probably macular degeneration. He couldn't see straight ahead, certainly by the mid-1930s. He could only see sideways in peripheral vision. And so I think he started to get desperate a little bit, and so he agreed to that. They did not do that. And reading the correspondence about the back and forth at the University of Texas, Reaugh Bassett got involved. And I'm sorry to tell you this, but it's important that you understand that what you see of 24 Hours with the Herd is not Mr. Ray anymore. They were damaged so badly in that transition between 1938 and now. Mostly what you see is Reaugh Bassett, because he repainted them. They're not him anymore. And so ultimately what happened in 1945 when he died, and his trustee list was a who's who of Texas. It really was. But unfortunately, trying to find a place for a couple of thousand pencil sketches, archival records, pastel sketches, and so on, was offered to a couple of different public Texas institutions, and I don't want to embarrass anybody, but they declined. They weren't interested. And so eventually Canyon was decided on in 1966. He's been dead 21 years by this time. So Panhandle Plains was given all the field sketches. They were given about 600 and then another 500 to sell for the care and feeding, which was I don't want to say that was standard procedure back in the day, but we used to sell Frank Ray's in the museum store at Panhandle Plains. And to see the record books that are $15 and $25, and I don't know what they all look like, but I can usually tell when I see one. And that's not to Panhandle Plains' detriment. It's a history museum with an art collection. That's important to remember. And the archive at Panhandle Plains is the only one in Texas, in my opinion, that rivals what's at UT because of the depth and breadth there. There are 3 million artifacts there. 3 million artifacts. And that's not counting the shelf fee of archives. So when the trustees gave it to Panhandle Plains in 1966, they thought they were done. And then another 217 went to Texas Tech University at Lubbock without approval of the trustees, so those reside there illegally. I didn't make the judgment in Dallas District Court, a judge did. And then in the early 70s, Panhandle Plains worked out a swap with the University of Texas for some of the larger ones, because UT didn't get any in the original gift, and they wanted something that was more comprehensive of Mr. Ray's work. So approaching herd, watering the herd, Roundup, early cattle, cattle April is there, herding the cattle, Monarch of the Plains. It's about a half dozen large paintings went down to UT, and I don't remember exactly how many small ones went or came to Panhandle Plains, and then I don't know how many went down to UT. And Approaching Herd used to belong to the University of Texas. Last time I checked, their mascot is a longhorn. Oops. But, we were glad to hang it, and we actually shared that painting with President Bush. W hung that over his private desk in the White House. So every time you go in and look at that, remember, George Bush saw that through 7 years of his presidency. I'm very proud of that, needless to say. So, I'm sorry, did I answer your question? Okay. Yes, sir.
Thomas Allen was the chairman of the jury of the 1893 Exposition. And Thomas Allen and Ray share similar skills in painting animals.
Yep.
Did they ever run across have any relationship with know each other?
I've never run across any correspondence. Mr. Ray's correspondence was saved sort of haphazard. What happened is that some of the records went to UT with the initial gift, and they're in the HRC. But many of the records were kept by the trustees personally. And I know of at least one instance where a trustee's garage in Highland Park, the roof fell in on those records, and we don't know how much turned to mush. So I never have run across any correspondence with Allen, and it's actually a good question, because Allen was primarily based in Boston, And William Rudolph talked about the assembling of the State Fair art exhibitions yesterday and talked about how Robert and Julian were part of that. Well, what he didn't mention was Mr. Ray did all the other cities. He did New England, including Boston. He did the Midwest, Cincinnati, Cleveland, Chicago, Detroit. That's where he secured paintings for the show. He gets no credit for that because it's always the Onderdonks, but the Onderdonks worked in tandem. I think there was a little bit of friction between Mr. Ray and Robert Onderdonk, largely because when the Dallas Art Students League was founded in 1890, they went to San Antonio to secure a professor, and Mr. Ray's already living in Dallas. And he had as good a training record as Onderdonk did by this time. So he took that as a personal insult, one of many that Dallas threw his way. So I don't know specifically of a relationship between him and Thomas Allen. I do know his relationship with Halsey Ives, who was in charge of the World's Columbian Exposition, all the art shows. Halsey Ives also went to St. Louis for the Louisiana Purchase in 1904, and so Mr. Ray had a really good relationship with both Chicago and St. Louis as both an artist and also as a securer of art for the state of Texas. So does that answer your question? I don't know of one, but they probably did. Ken.
I didn't really have to raise my hand because I already had the microphone, but enjoyed the talk, fascinating stuff. I was hoping that you could talk a little more about the multimedia aspects of 24 Hours with the Herd, the incorporation of music. Specifically, is there anything in Ray's presentation of his work before or after that anticipates that sort of multimedia? And if not, where does that come from?
Well, it's a great question. Mr. Ray was a great literature reader, and he was a great follower of John Burroughs and Louis Agassiz. That's some of his first books. His mother, Clorinda, really pushed all the fine arts on him, including music and literature. So he was a great reader, and he loved John Burroughs. And I think they may have had a correspondence at some point, certainly Hamlin Garland, too, as I mentioned before. But Mr. Ray loved music, played the guitar. And I know of a man who owns his guitar. Rats. But in any case, he loved fiddle music in particular. He loved what he called Negro spirituals. His grandfather was a Presbyterian minister, so he loved hymns. He was not a regular churchgoer necessarily, but performance was very much part of that. And 24 Hours with the Herd, I think, was quite groundbreaking in the mid-1920s when he unveils it in Oak Cliff. Especially because it's multimedia, because I didn't mention that Clyde Walton Hill and David Guion were very much part of the group who put that together, both in terms of the prose and also the music. And David Guion, of course, is best known for putting Home on the Range to music, to the way we know it today, and that's pretty important. Mr. Ray really did move in circles, historic circles, that most people don't realize today, because we've made him Texas's own. It's time to share him, folks. It's time to share him with the rest of the world. And this exhibition is a huge step in that direction.
We have time for one last question.
Yes, sir.
So Mr. Ray was still active in the late 20s, I suppose.
Yes.
Is there any record that he had any interest in the Davis competition?
It's a great question. I'm so glad that's not a plant, by the way. When I was doing the research for the Texas Impressionism exhibition, and of course the Davis competitions are critical to understanding that, I looked for any sort of evidence that he was interested in that. I don't find that he ever submitted anything, and I think by this is 1927. He's dabbling in his inventions. He's working with the Lemesson pump, making pastels. He's active in all kinds of different things. I think by that time he felt he was above being juried, frankly. Dawson Watson, of course, wins the first prize. And this is a little side rabbit trail, so bear with me. I suspect that when here's what you need to understand. When Dawson Watson and E. Richardson Cherry go to Giverny, Mr. Ray's at the Académie Julian at exactly the same time. So's John Elliott Jenkins. And we know Jenkins went to Giverny. I always wondered if Mr. Ray went to Giverny. But he was also very much a loner, and he talks about what he visited. So I think that the answer to the question is there are these tantalizing things like that. Did he submit anything to the Wildflower competition? And in the Panhandle Plains collection, there's a triptych of blue bonnets, and each one is as big as my thumb. And it's spectacular. It really is. Yes, sir.
Well, now that you're at the National Cowboy Museum, isn't it time for an exhibition on Reaugh and Western art?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. It's the appropriate place to do it because remember, it is the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum. Frankly, Texas didn't make a play for it in 1955, which just baffles me. It absolutely baffles me as an historian why we didn't make a play for it here in this state. There were 3 finalists, Dodge City, Colorado Springs, and Oklahoma City. And Oklahoma City got it because they had Route 66. It's really the only reason, and they had the financial backing. So it is time for a 3 R's exhibition, and I'd sure like to give it a try. The Cowboy Museum does own a small Frank Ray. Yes, sir, I will. Stay tuned. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael.